When ice took over New York, the 1947 blizzard that paralyzed modern America for days. It was the day after Christmas. The city that never sleeps was about to be silenced by something no one saw coming. When ice took over New York, when the blizzard of 1947 descended upon 8 million people without warning, modern America discovered just how fragile progress really was. This is the story of the storm that buried the greatest city on Earth. Chapter 1. The Morning That Changed Everything. On the morning of December 26, 1947, New York City awoke to a world that appeared perfectly normal. The Christmas decorations still hung in apartment windows across Manhattan. Leftover turkey sat in refrigerators throughout Brooklyn. Children in Queens clutched new toys, still excited from the previous day's celebrations. The city hummed with its usual post-holiday rhythm, a gentle pause before the final week of the year. Margaret Sullivan lived in a modest apartment on West 43rd Street, just blocks from Times Square. She was 34 years old, a secretary at a midtown law firm, and she had spent Christmas Day with her elderly mother in the Bronx. That morning, she woke early, around 6 o'clock, to catch the subway back to Manhattan. Through her bedroom window, she noticed something unusual. A thin layer of white covered the fire escape. Snow had begun falling sometime during the night. Margaret thought nothing of it. Snow in late December was hardly remarkable. The weather forecast from the previous evening had mentioned cloudiness with occasional flurries. Nothing that would disrupt her plans. She dressed warmly, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and kissed her mother goodbye. At that same hour, across the East River in Brooklyn, Thomas Brennan was preparing for his shift at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Thomas was 41, a welder who had spent the war years building ships that carried American soldiers across the Atlantic. Now in peacetime, the yard still operated, though at a slower pace. Thomas had worked Christmas Day, earning double pay, and he was scheduled to return that morning. His wife Eleanor stood at the kitchen stove, preparing coffee and toast. Their 3 children, ages 8, 11, and 14, were still asleep, exhausted from the excitement of Christmas. Eleanor glanced out the window and noticed the snow falling steadily. The flakes seemed larger than usual, thick and heavy, descending in a continuous curtain of white. Thomas noticed it too. He had grown up in Boston and knew winter storms well. Something about this snow felt different. The way it fell so silently, so persistently. He mentioned it to Eleanor, but she dismissed his concern. The radio had said nothing about a major storm. Just flurries, the announcer had promised. Nothing to worry about. By 7 o'clock that morning, the snow had already accumulated to 3 inches across most of the city. On the streets of Manhattan, the first commuters were beginning their journeys. Buses ran along their usual routes. Taxis picked up passengers outside Grand Central Terminal. The elevated trains rumbled along their tracks, their wheels cutting through the thin layer of white that had gathered on the rails. In Midtown, newspaper vendors set up their stands selling copies of the morning papers. The headlines spoke of post-war reconstruction in Europe, of political debates in Washington, of the usual concerns of a nation still adjusting to peace. Not a single front page mentioned the weather. Not one editor had thought to warn readers about what was coming. The snow continued to fall. By 8 o'clock it had reached 5 inches. By 9, 7 inches. The flakes seemed to grow larger with each passing hour, some as wide as silver dollars, descending so thickly that visibility dropped to less than a block. New Yorkers began to realize that something extraordinary was happening. Margaret Sullivan stood on a subway platform at the 138th Street station in the Bronx, waiting for a train that was running late. Around her, other commuters stamped their feet against the cold, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Snow drifted down through the gaps in the elevated platform, coating their shoulders and hats. Someone muttered about the weather. Someone else checked their watch impatiently. The train finally arrived, 20 minutes behind schedule. Margaret squeezed aboard, pressed against other passengers in the crowded car. Through the windows, she watched the city disappear behind a curtain of white. Buildings faded into ghosts. Streetlights became dim halos. The world was vanishing before her eyes. Thomas Brennan never made it to the Navy Yard that morning. He had walked 3 blocks from his home when the snow became so intense that he could barely see his own feet. The wind had picked up slightly, driving the flakes into his face like tiny needles. He turned back, struggling against the accumulating drifts, and returned home to find Eleanor standing at the window, watching the storm with growing alarm. The children had woken up. They pressed their faces against the glass, marveling at the snow, not yet understanding the danger. To them it was an adventure, a magical continuation of Christmas, They begged to go outside and play. Eleanor told them to wait. Something in her voice made them obey. By noon, the snow had reached 15 inches and showed no signs of stopping. The city that had dismissed the weather forecast as routine was now confronting a crisis unlike anything it had experienced in decades. Traffic ground to a halt on major thoroughfares. Buses became stranded in the middle of intersections, their wheels spinning uselessly against the packed snow. Taxis abandoned their vehicles and sought shelter in nearby buildings. On Fifth Avenue, one of the most famous streets in the world, a line of automobiles stretched for blocks, none of them moving. Drivers sat helplessly behind their steering wheels, watching the snow pile up around their cars. Some turned off their engines to conserve fuel. Others kept them running for warmth, not knowing how long they would be trapped. The great city was freezing in place. In Times Square, the news ticker on the New York Times building continued to scroll headlines, but fewer and fewer people were there to read them. The bustling crossroads of the world had become eerily quiet. The neon signs still glowed, advertising Broadway shows and consumer products, but they illuminated empty sidewalks. The theater district, usually crowded with tourists and locals alike, stood abandoned. Margaret Sullivan finally reached her office building on Lexington Avenue around 2 in the afternoon, nearly 8 hours after she had begun her journey. Her coat was soaked through, her shoes were ruined. Her fingers had grown numb despite her gloves. When she pushed through the lobby doors, she found the building nearly empty. Only a handful of employees had managed to arrive. Her supervisor, a stern man named Mr. Harrison, told her she might as well go home. The office was closing early, but Margaret looked out the window at the wall of white and knew that going home was no longer possible. She was stranded in Manhattan, separated from her mother by a storm that had transformed the city into an impassable wilderness. Across the 5 boroughs, similar scenes were unfolding. Workers trapped in their offices, shoppers stranded in department stores, students stuck at schools with no way to reach their families. The storm had descended so quickly, so unexpectedly, that it had caught millions of people in the wrong places at the wrong times, and still the snow continued to fall. By 3 o'clock, it had reached 18 inches. By 4, 20 inches. The Weather Bureau, finally acknowledging the severity of the situation, issued warnings that came far too late to help anyone. The forecasters who had predicted occasional flurries now watched in disbelief as their instruments recorded snowfall rates of 3 inches per hour. They had never seen anything like it. Neither had New York. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one remind us how quickly the ordinary can become extraordinary, how a single day can change everything. Subscribe now so you never miss a moment when history speaks. Chapter 2. The City Frozen. As darkness fell on December 26, 1947, New York City entered a night unlike any in living memory. The snow had not stopped. If anything, it seemed to intensify as the temperature dropped and the sky turned from gray to black. The flakes fell so thickly that streetlights could barely penetrate the white curtain. The city that never sleeps was being smothered into silence. 26.4 inches, or. That was the final measurement in Central Park when the snow finally stopped falling in the early hours of December 27th. More than 2 feet of snow had fallen in less than 24 hours, the heaviest single snowfall in the recorded history of New York City. Not even the legendary blizzard of 1888, which had killed hundreds and become the stuff of local legend, had deposited this much snow. But the numbers told only part of the story. What mattered was what those numbers meant for the 8 million people who lived in the 5 boroughs, and for the millions more in the surrounding suburbs and states who found themselves equally paralyzed. On the streets of Manhattan, an estimated 30,000 vehicles sat abandoned, buried under drifts that reached the tops of their hoods. Cars that had been pristine just hours earlier now resembled white mounds, indistinguishable from the snowbanks that surrounded them. Buses had become immobile shelters, their passengers long since fled, their engines cold and silent. The subway system, the lifeline of the city, had ground to a halt. The underground portions continued to operate, but the elevated sections, which ran through parts of Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens, were impassable. Third rails had frozen. Switches had become locked in place by ice. Trains sat on tracks like sleeping giants, waiting for a thaw that would not come for days. In Grand Central Terminal, hundreds of stranded travelers settled in for an unexpected night. Fathers and their children spread coats on the marble floors of the main concourse, using suitcases as pillows. The great vaulted ceiling, painted with constellations, looked down on scenes of quiet desperation. The information booth, usually a hub of activity, had become a gathering point for people seeking any news about when the trains might run again. A photographer from Life magazine captured an image that would become iconic. A father lying on the floor with his two young sons, their faces illuminated by the terminal's lights, waiting for a train to take them home to Connecticut. They would wait all night. The trains would not move until morning, and even then, service would be severely limited. Margaret Sullivan found shelter in her office building that night. The security guard, a kind man named Walter, had allowed stranded workers to sleep in the lobby. Margaret shared the space with a dozen other people, strangers brought together by circumstance. They pooled what food they had, sharing sandwiches and crackers from a nearby delicatessen that had opened its doors to help. She worried about her mother, alone in the Bronx apartment. Margaret had tried to call, but the telephone lines were overwhelmed. Thousands of people were trying to reach their loved ones simultaneously, and the system could not handle the demand. She would not learn until the next day that her mother was safe, that neighbors had checked on her and brought her food. In Brooklyn, Thomas Brennan spent the night reinforcing his home against the cold. The coal furnace in the basement struggled to keep the temperature comfortable as the wind found every crack and gap in the old building. Eleanor gathered extra blankets from the closets and piled them on the children's beds. They ate leftovers from Christmas dinner, grateful that the refrigerator was still working. Outside their windows, the street had become unrecognizable. The cars that usually lined the curbs had vanished beneath white dunes. The fire hydrant on the corner showed only its cap above the snow. A streetlight burned feebly, its glow barely reaching the ground through the accumulated white. Across the city, similar scenes unfolded in homes and apartments, in hotels and hospitals, in police stations and firehouses. New York was experiencing something unprecedented, a complete shutdown of normal life. Nothing moved. Nothing functioned as it should. The greatest city in the world had been reduced to a collection of isolated neighborhoods, each one cut off from the others by walls of frozen white. The human cost began to emerge as the night wore on. Emergency calls flooded police switchboards, but officers could not respond. Their patrol cars were stuck. Their precincts were understaffed because so many officers had been unable to report for duty. Heart conditions proved fatal for some who overexerted themselves shoveling snow. Accidents on icy stairs and sidewalks sent others to hospitals that were struggling to maintain basic operations. 77 people would eventually lose their lives as a result of the storm. Some succumbed to the cold, others suffered fatal heart attacks while trying to dig out their vehicles. Still others were killed in accidents caused by the treacherous conditions. Each death represented a family shattered, a future erased, a reminder that nature's power could strike without warning, even in the heart of civilization. The hospitals themselves faced unprecedented challenges. Ambulances could not reach patients in need. Staff members could not reach the hospitals. Operating rooms ran with skeleton crews. Maternity wards delivered babies with minimal assistance. Every department struggled to maintain basic standards of care as the snow continued to fall and the city remained frozen. At Bellevue Hospital, the largest in the city, administrators made desperate decisions. Doctors who had completed their shifts were asked to stay and cover for colleagues who could not arrive. Nurses worked double and triple shifts without complaint. Maintenance workers who happened to be on duty when the storm began found themselves trapped at work for days. One story emerged from that night that would be told and retold in the years to come. A pregnant woman in Queens went into labor while the storm raged at its peak. Her husband tried desperately to reach a hospital, but their car became stuck within blocks of their apartment. Neighbors heard the commotion and came to help. A retired nurse who lived 2 floors below delivered the baby by candlelight when the power flickered. Mother and child both survived, a small miracle amid the chaos. Such acts of kindness and courage occurred throughout the city that night. Strangers helped strangers. Neighbors who had barely spoken suddenly found themselves working together. The isolation imposed by the storm paradoxically brought people closer. Communities that had grown anonymous in the rush of city life rediscovered their connections. By dawn on December 27th, the snow had finally stopped. The sky began to clear, revealing a transformed landscape. New York City lay buried under a white blanket so vast and complete that it seemed almost peaceful from above. The sharp edges of the urban environment had been softened. The harsh geometry of the streets had been rounded into gentle curves. The city looked like something from a dream, but on the ground, the reality was harsh. The cleanup had to begin, and no one knew how long it would take. Chapter 3. Digging Out. The morning of December 27th, 1947, dawned cold and clear over a city that seemed to have been transported to another world. The familiar skyline of Manhattan still rose against the sky, but everything at street level had changed. Mountains of white obscured buildings, valleys of snow filled the spaces between. The city lay silent, waiting. Mayor William O'Dwyer faced the greatest crisis of his administration. He had been elected 2 years earlier on promises of efficiency and modernization. Now he confronted a disaster that exposed just how vulnerable even the most advanced city remained to the forces of nature. The snow removal equipment that the city possessed was woefully inadequate. The workforce available for the cleanup was a fraction of what would be needed. O'Dwyer mobilized every resource at his disposal. 18,000 workers would eventually be deployed to clear the snow, a massive effort that would take more than a week to complete. Dump trucks that normally hauled construction materials were pressed into service. Private contractors were hired at emergency rates. The military offered assistance, sending equipment and personnel to help. But these reinforcements would take time to organize. In the immediate aftermath of the storm, the burden fell on ordinary citizens. Across the 5 boroughs, people emerged from their homes with shovels in hand, ready to dig out their piece of the city. Thomas Brennan was among the first on his block to venture outside that morning. The snow came up to his waist when he stepped off his stoop. He had to push through it like a swimmer forcing through heavy surf, each step requiring enormous effort. His breath fogged in the frigid air as he surveyed the damage. The street was impassable. Not a single car could be seen beneath the drifts that had formed during the night. The sidewalk had vanished entirely. Even the stoops of the neighboring brownstones were buried, their steps hidden beneath smooth slopes of white. Thomas realized that before anyone could go anywhere, hours of backbreaking labor would be required. He began to shovel. His neighbors joined him one by one, emerging from their doors with their own tools. Men who worked in offices and factories, who rarely performed manual labor, found themselves moving tons of snow by hand. Women helped where they could, bringing hot coffee and sandwiches to the workers. Children, delighted by the adventure, tried to assist but mostly played in the drifts. A spirit of cooperation emerged that transcended the usual boundaries of city life. On that block in Brooklyn, as on thousands of others across the city, people who had lived as strangers discovered that they were neighbors. They learned each other's names. They shared stories while they worked. They took breaks together, laughing at the absurdity of their situation. In Manhattan, the challenges were even more severe. The narrow streets of Lower Manhattan had become canyons of snow. The wide avenues of Midtown were impassable rivers of white. Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, Broadway, all the great thoroughfares that gave the city its character, lay buried and silent. Margaret Sullivan ventured out from her office building around noon, after the security guard assured her that the streets were at least somewhat passable. She found a city transformed beyond recognition. The landmarks she knew so well were obscured or distorted by the snow. She walked for blocks without seeing a single moving vehicle. The sounds she heard were strange and unfamiliar, shovels scraping against pavement, people calling to each other across the white expanse, the occasional rumble of a snowplow in the distance. She made her way to Grand Central Terminal, hoping to catch a train to the Bronx. The station was packed with people who had the same idea. Families sat on benches, waiting. Businessmen in overcoats paced impatiently. Mothers tried to entertain restless children. The departure board showed delays and cancellations for almost every route. The trains were beginning to run again, but slowly. The crews who cleared the tracks worked as fast as they could, but the sheer volume of snow made progress painfully incremental. Each mile of track had to be cleared by hand or by machines that struggled against drifts deeper than they were designed to handle. What normally took minutes now took hours. Margaret found a spot on a bench and settled in to wait. Around her, conversations buzzed with questions and complaints. Why had there been no warning? Why was the city so unprepared? How could the greatest metropolis on earth be brought to its knees by snow? These questions would be asked many times in the days and weeks to come, and the answers would reshape how New York approached winter weather for decades. In the Bronx, Thomas Brennan's mother-in-law lived alone in an apartment near Yankee Stadium. She was 73 years old and in declining health. The family had not heard from her since Christmas morning, before the storm began. As the hours passed on December 27th, Eleanor's worry grew into genuine fear. Thomas made a decision. He would walk to her apartment, a distance of about 4 miles. His wife protested, pointing out that the streets were still barely passable, that he could easily become lost or injured, but Thomas knew he had to try. If the old woman was in trouble, every hour of delay could matter. He set out around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, bundled in every warm garment he owned. The journey that normally took 30 minutes by subway would take him nearly 4 hours. He trudged through drifts that sometimes reached his chest. He climbed over abandoned vehicles. He helped other travelers he encountered along the way, and they helped him. When he finally reached his mother-in-law's building, he found her safe, but frightened. She had run out of coal for her stove and had spent the night huddled under blankets, unable to keep warm. Thomas spent an hour digging a path to the coal bin in the basement, then carried buckets of fuel up 3 flights of stairs. He made sure she had food and water, checked that her telephone was working, and promised to return the next day. Then he began the long walk home. Stories like these multiplied across the city in those first days after the storm. Acts of courage and compassion, large and small, wove through the narrative of the disaster. People discovered reserves of strength they did not know they possessed. They found generosity in neighbors they had never trusted. The crisis revealed not just the city's vulnerabilities, but also its resilience. The cleanup operation grew more organized as the days passed. By December 29th, the main arteries of the city were beginning to clear. Buses resumed limited service. The subway system approached something like normal operation. Taxis reappeared on the streets, though they charged premium rates that sparked angry complaints. The snow had to go somewhere, and the disposal became its own challenge. Mountains of the white stuff accumulated at collection points throughout the city. Some was trucked to the rivers and dumped into the water. Some was piled in vacant lots, where it would take months to fully melt. Some was simply pushed to the sides of streets, creating walls that would persist well into the new year. If this story has touched you, leave a comment saying, "We often forget how much we can do when we help each other." Those few words carry the heart of everything we have seen today. Leave that comment and become part of this community that believes in the power of human connection. Chapter 4. The Storm's Toll. As New York City slowly emerged from beneath its white blanket, the full scope of the disaster began to reveal itself. The storm that had arrived so silently, that had fallen so gently through the night, had left devastation in its wake. The toll was measured not just in inches of snow, but in lives lost, families disrupted, and systems broken. 77 people had perished. The number seemed almost modest compared to the great disasters that occasionally struck American cities, the hurricanes and earthquakes and floods that claimed hundreds or thousands. But each of those 77 represented an individual tragedy, a story of hopes cut short and futures erased. Among the dead was a 58-year-old shopkeeper from the Lower East Side who had suffered a heart attack while shoveling snow in front of his store. His wife found him collapsed in the drift, his shovel still clutched in his frozen hands. He had survived the war years, when his shop had struggled against rationing and shortages. He had seen his children grow into adults and his grandchildren take their first steps. And now he was gone, claimed by a storm that no one had predicted. There was the elderly widow from Staten Island who had lived alone in a small house near the ferry terminal. She had not been found until 2 days after the storm, when a neighbor finally managed to check on her. The cold had taken her quietly in the night. She lay in her bed as if sleeping, her hands folded across her chest, a peaceful expression on her face. She had been 91 years old and had told stories of the blizzard of 1888 to anyone who would listen. Now she had become a victim of its successor, and there were the accident victims, those who had died on icy roads and frozen sidewalks. A bus driver in Queens who had lost control of his vehicle on a patch of black ice. A pedestrian in the Bronx who had been struck by a skidding car. A construction worker in Manhattan who had fallen from a roof while trying to clear snow. Each death left behind a wake of grief that would persist long after the snow had melted. The injured numbered in the hundreds. Hospitals reported a surge in cases of frostbite, hypothermia, and fractures from falls. Emergency rooms that had struggled to maintain operations during the storm now overflowed with patients seeking treatment. Doctors worked around the clock, catching sleep in supply closets and break rooms between shifts. The economic damage was harder to calculate, but no less severe. Businesses had lost days of operation during the busiest shopping season of the year. Factories had shut down for lack of workers. Restaurants had closed for lack of supplies. The cumulative loss was estimated at millions of dollars, an enormous sum in 1947. For many small businesses, the storm was a disaster from which they would never fully recover. A bakery in Brooklyn had lost its entire stock of perishables when the power went out. A clothing store in Manhattan had suffered water damage when snow melted through a weakened roof. A taxi company in Queens had seen half its fleet damaged by abandoned vehicles. But the storm's impact extended beyond the immediate losses. It exposed fundamental weaknesses in the city's infrastructure, vulnerabilities that had accumulated over years of neglect and underinvestment. The snow removal equipment was inadequate. The communication systems were overwhelmed. The emergency response protocols proved woefully unprepared for a disaster of this magnitude. In the weeks following the storm, angry citizens demanded answers. How had the Weather Bureau failed so completely to predict the storm? Why had the city not been better prepared? Who was responsible for the chaos that had paralyzed the greatest metropolis on Earth? The Weather Bureau defended itself by pointing to the limitations of forecasting technology in 1947. There were no weather satellites orbiting the Earth, no computer models processing vast amounts of data, no Doppler radar tracking storms in real time. Meteorologists relied on surface observations and upper air soundings, on reports from ships at sea and aircraft in flight. The science was still primitive, and the storm had developed in ways that the existing tools could not detect. But these explanations satisfied few. The public had grown accustomed to relying on weather forecasts, and the failure of those forecasts to predict the storm shattered that confidence. People began to demand improvements, investments in new technologies and methods that could prevent such a failure from happening again. The city government also faced scrutiny. Mayor O'Dwyer convened hearings to examine the response to the storm and identify lessons for the future. Officials testified about the challenges they had faced, the decisions they had made, the obstacles they had encountered. The hearings revealed a patchwork of agencies with overlapping responsibilities and inadequate coordination, a bureaucracy ill-suited to respond to emergencies. The outcome of these investigations would reshape how New York approached winter weather for generations. New protocols were developed, new equipment was purchased, new training programs were implemented. The city that had been caught so completely off guard by the storm of 1947 would never be so vulnerable again. But these changes lay in the future. In the immediate aftermath of the storm, the focus remained on the slow, grinding work of recovery. Streets had to be cleared, services had to be restored, life had to return to normal. For Margaret Sullivan, normal meant finally reaching her mother in the Bronx on December 28th. She had taken a train that crept along at a fraction of its usual speed, stopping frequently as crews cleared debris from the tracks. When she finally reached her mother's apartment, she found the old woman tired but safe. Neighbors had brought food. The building superintendent had kept the furnace running. The community had come together in the crisis. Margaret stayed with her mother for several days, helping with the cleanup and keeping her company during the long winter nights. They talked about the storm, about the strange adventure it had been. They talked about the old days, about the mother's memories of the blizzard of 1888, when she had been a young girl. The two storms now linked in family memory, touchstones of a city's resilience. For Thomas Brennan, normal meant returning to work at the Navy Yard on December 30th after the roads had finally been cleared enough to allow his commute. He found the yard transformed by the storm, its usual orderliness disrupted by drifts that workers were still clearing from among the ships and buildings. His supervisor shook his hand and thanked him for showing up. Half the workforce had still not managed to return. Thomas worked his shift and returned home to Eleanor and the children. They ate dinner together, a simple meal made special by the shared experience of survival. The children told stories of their adventures in the snow, the forts they had built, and the snowmen they had shaped. Their parents listened and smiled, grateful that the worst was over. The storm of 1947 would live on in the memories of those who experienced it. For decades afterward, New Yorkers would share their stories of that Christmas week, of the snow that fell without warning and buried their city. These stories passed from parents to children, from grandparents to grandchildren, becoming part of the collective mythology of the city. Chapter 5. Lessons in the Snow. The weeks following the Great Blizzard of 1947 became a time of reckoning for New York City. As the last remnants of snow melted from the streets and the rhythms of urban life gradually resumed, a deeper process of examination and reflection began. The storm had exposed truths that could not be ignored, weaknesses that demanded attention, and possibilities that had gone unexplored. The Weather Bureau bore the brunt of initial criticism. Its forecasters had predicted light snow and cold temperatures for December 26th, a routine winter day that would require no special preparations. Instead, the city had received the heaviest single snowfall in its recorded history. The discrepancy was too great to dismiss as mere bad luck. Internal reviews revealed the limitations of the Bureau's methods. The storm had formed over the Atlantic Ocean, where observation stations were sparse. It had intensified rapidly as warm, moist air from the Gulf Stream collided with cold air from the north, a process that the existing tools could not track in real time. By the time forecasters recognized what was happening, the snow was already falling on Manhattan. The Bureau's director acknowledged the failure and pledged reforms. New observation posts would be established along the Atlantic coast. New procedures would be implemented for updating forecasts as conditions changed. New research would be funded to better understand the dynamics of winter storms. The science of meteorology would have to advance if such failures were to be prevented. But the storm also prompted a broader conversation about the relationship between cities and nature. New York had grown into a metropolis of unprecedented scale and complexity, a place where millions of people lived and worked within a few hundred square miles. This concentration of humanity brought enormous advantages: economic opportunity, cultural richness, social vitality, but it also created vulnerabilities. The city depended on systems that functioned smoothly and continuously. Transportation networks carried workers to their jobs, supply chains delivered food and fuel, communication lines connected people across vast distances. When these systems failed, as they had during the storm, the consequences rippled outward with alarming speed. The lesson was clear: a city of this size and complexity could not afford to be complacent. The natural world, with all its power and unpredictability, remained a force to be reckoned with. Progress had not tamed nature. It had merely created new ways for nature to disrupt human plans. This realization prompted investments that would transform how New York approached winter weather. The city purchased new snow removal equipment, more plows, more trucks, more salt spreaders. It hired additional workers and trained them in emergency protocols. It developed coordination plans with neighboring jurisdictions, recognizing that storms did not respect political boundaries. The subway system received particular attention. The storm had revealed how vulnerable the elevated sections were to heavy snow, while the underground portions had continued to operate. Planners began to think more carefully about which routes should be prioritized during emergencies, how to maintain service to hospitals and other critical facilities, how to communicate with passengers when disruptions occurred. Private businesses also drew lessons from the experience. Companies that had lost days of operation began to develop contingency plans. They stockpiled supplies that would allow them to function during emergencies. They cross-trained employees so that absences could be covered. They invested in communication systems that would keep workers informed when conditions deteriorated. The insurance industry revised its models to account for the risk of severe winter storms. Premiums rose for businesses in vulnerable areas. New policies were developed to cover specific winter-related losses. The financial infrastructure of risk management adapted to the new reality that the storm had revealed. For ordinary citizens, the lessons were more personal. Families who had been caught unprepared resolved to do better in the future. They stocked their homes with extra food, extra fuel, extra blankets. They made plans for how to reach loved ones if normal communication failed. They learned to pay closer attention to weather forecasts, even when those forecasts seemed routine. Margaret Sullivan never forgot the fear she had felt during those 2 days when she could not reach her mother. She installed a telephone in her own apartment for the first time, determined that she would never again be cut off from the people she loved. She also began to keep an emergency kit in her closet: candles, matches, canned food, a hand-cranked radio. These precautions seemed excessive to some of her friends, but Margaret remembered the storm. Thomas Brennan taught his children to respect the power of nature. He told them stories of the walk he had made through the snow to reach their grandmother, of the struggle to push through drifts that reached his chest, of the cold that had seeped into his bones despite his layers of clothing. He wanted them to understand that the modern world, with all its conveniences, remained subject to forces beyond human control. The storm also left its mark on the cultural life of the city. Photographers who had captured images of the buried streets found their work in demand. Writers composed essays and poems about the experience. Filmmakers included footage of the aftermath in documentaries and newsreels. The blizzard became a reference point, a shared memory that bound New Yorkers together across the divisions of class and neighborhood. In the years that followed, Whenever a major snowstorm threatened the city, people would invoke the memory of 1947. They would compare forecasts and accumulation totals, debating whether the new storm might rival the old one. These conversations served a purpose beyond mere nostalgia. They reminded New Yorkers that they had faced such challenges before and survived, that their city possessed reserves of strength and resilience that could be called upon when needed. The storm also entered the scientific literature as a case study in the dynamics of winter weather. Meteorologists analyzed the conditions that had produced such unexpected intensity. They traced the movement of air masses across the Atlantic, the collision of warm and cold fronts, the feedback loops that had amplified the snowfall beyond all predictions. These studies contributed to the growing body of knowledge about how weather systems behaved, knowledge that would eventually make forecasting far more accurate. Decades later, when satellites circled the Earth and computer models processed billions of calculations, meteorologists could predict major storms days in advance. They could track the development of winter systems across entire ocean basins, watching as conditions aligned for significant weather events. The failures of 1947 had motivated the investments and research that made such capabilities possible. But even with all these advances, the fundamental lesson of the storm remained relevant. Nature would always retain the capacity to surprise. No technology could eliminate uncertainty. No preparation could guarantee safety. The best that any city could do was to remain humble in the face of forces larger than itself, to prepare as thoroughly as possible, and to trust that when crises came, people would find ways to help each other through. Chapter 6. The City Remembers. Decades passed. The snow of December 1947 melted into history, joining the long list of events that had shaped New York City over the centuries. New storms came and went, some nearly as severe, none quite as unexpected. The city grew and changed, its skyline reaching ever higher, its population swelling and shifting. See its character evolving in ways that would have astonished the people who had dug out from under that record-breaking snowfall. But the memory persisted. In 1988, 41 years after the storm, newspapers ran retrospective articles marking the anniversary. Reporters tracked down survivors, now elderly, who shared their recollections of that Christmas week. The stories had grown richer with time, embellished by decades of retelling, but the core experiences remained: the surprise, the fear, the struggle, the solidarity. Margaret Sullivan was 75 years old in 1988, living in a retirement community in New Jersey. Her mother had passed away years earlier, but Margaret still kept the emergency kit in her closet, still paid close attention to weather forecasts. When a reporter called to ask about her memories of the storm, she spoke for nearly an hour, her voice animated with the vivid details she had carried through the decades. She remembered the silence of the city on that first morning, how the usual cacophony of traffic and voices had been replaced by an eerie quiet. She remembered the faces of the strangers she had shared the lobby with, the way they had pooled their food and their stories. She remembered the joy of finally reaching her mother, of finding her safe when so much had seemed uncertain. Thomas Brennan had passed away in 1973, but his children remembered his stories. His oldest son, now in his 50s, told a reporter about the walk through the snow, about his father's determination to reach his grandmother. The story had become family legend, repeated at holiday gatherings, held up as an example of what it meant to take responsibility for those you loved. The grandchildren listened with wonder to tales of a time before cell phones and GPS, when a man could disappear into a blizzard and his family could only wait and hope for his return. They tried to imagine their city buried under more than 2 feet of snow, tried to picture the streets they knew so well transformed into impassable white canyons. The past seemed impossibly remote, yet the stories made it feel immediate. In 2006, nearly 60 years after the original storm, New York experienced another major snowfall. The February blizzard deposited 26.9 inches in Central Park, finally surpassing the record set in 1947. But by then, the city was far better prepared. Weather satellites had tracked the storm across the Atlantic. Computer models had predicted its intensity days in advance. Emergency protocols had swung into action before the first flake fell. Schools closed preemptively. Public transportation adjusted its schedules. Salt trucks and plows staged at strategic locations throughout the city. When the snow arrived, the systems designed to manage it were ready. The disruption was significant but not catastrophic. Life resumed its normal pace within days rather than weeks. Those who remembered 1947 noted the contrast with satisfaction. The investments made in the aftermath of that earlier storm had paid off many times over. The city had learned from its experience and emerged stronger. This was the proper response to disaster. Not despair but determination, not resignation but reform. Yet something had also been lost. The people who lived through the blizzard of 2006 did not share quite the same experience of community and solidarity that had emerged in 1947. The storm was managed rather than endured. People stayed in their homes, connected by television and internet, rather than venturing out to help their neighbors. The crisis was shorter, shallower, less transformative. Perhaps this was progress. Perhaps it was better that modern storms caused less disruption, less suffering, less need for heroic individual action. But those who remembered the old days sometimes wondered whether something important had been surrendered along with the danger. The blizzard of 1947 had revealed the best in people, precisely because it had demanded so much from them. In 2016, another major storm brought 27.5 inches to Central Park, setting a new record. Once again, the city's preparation and response limited the damage. Once again, life returned to normal with remarkable speed. The storm became a topic of conversation for a few weeks, a minor inconvenience in the flow of urban existence, and then faded from immediate attention. But in nursing homes and family gatherings, in historical societies and community centers, the stories of 1947 continued to circulate. Old photographs showed streets unrecognizable beneath their white burden. Old newspapers captured headlines that conveyed the shock of the unexpected. Old voices, preserved in recordings and transcripts, spoke of a time when the city had been humbled by nature and had found strength in its own people. The story of the Great Blizzard of 1947 was ultimately a story about resilience. It was about a city caught off guard by forces beyond its control, struggling to respond with inadequate tools and insufficient preparation. It was about the chaos that ensued when systems failed and plans collapsed, but it was also about what emerged from that chaos, the courage of individuals who helped strangers, the determination of communities that came together, the resolve of a society that learned from its failures and built something better. Every great city carries such stories in its collective memory. They are the narratives that define what a place means to its people, the tales that explain how the present emerged from the past. For New York, the blizzard of 1947 holds a special place in this mythology. It was the storm that came without warning and departed only after extracting a heavy price. It was the crisis that revealed both weakness and strength, both vulnerability and resilience. When ice took over New York, when the blizzard of 1947 paralyzed modern America for days, something was lost and something was gained. What was lost can be measured in the 77 lives that ended too soon, in the millions of dollars of damage, in the fear and suffering of millions trapped in a frozen city. But what was gained cannot be so easily calculated. It lives in the memories of those who survived, in the stories passed from generation to generation, in the systems and preparations that emerged from the experience. The snow that fell on December 26, 1947, has long since melted away, but its lessons endure. They remind us that progress is not a shield against the power of nature. They teach us that community matters most when times are hardest. They show us that cities are made not just of buildings and streets, but of the people who inhabit them and the bonds that connect them. And they whisper a quiet truth that every generation must learn anew. We are all, in the end, at the mercy of forces we cannot control. Our only choice is how we respond when those forces test us. The people of New York in 1947 responded with courage, with generosity, with the determination to survive and to help others survive. In doing so, they wrote a chapter in their city's story that still speaks to us today. The great city endured. It always does. If you watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Your engagement means everything to this community of history lovers. While you are here, please like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who appreciates powerful, true stories, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another journey through the remarkable moments that shaped our world. Together, we keep these memories alive. Together, we remember.